There's a smell that sticks to a certain kind of grief. It's not dramatic. It doesn't smell like hospitals or rain. It smells like burnt toast, cold coffee. The particular staleness of a kitchen where someone has been sitting too long, not eating, just staring at a phone screen they've already read 17 times. That's where I was. My dad's kitchen. The one I grew up in. The one with the chipped yellow tile around the sink that my parents always said they'd replace and never did. I was 29 years old, sitting at that table in a chair that still wobbled the same way it wobbled when I was 12, and I was reading a text message that had just ended, quietly, without ceremony, a relationship I'd spent my entire adult life trying to hold together. Reyna, I think it's best if we have some space right now. I've talked to your mother and we both agree. That was it. That was all of it. 29 years of being someone's daughter, reduced to 43 words and a blue check mark. Now. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, okay, families fight. Dads and daughters have rough patches. This is probably something she did, something she said, some falling out that spiraled. And look, I'm not going to sit here and tell you I was perfect. I wasn't. I had a temper when I was younger. I borrowed money and was slow to pay it back. I made choices my dad didn't understand. I gave him reasons to worry. But here's the thing. Here's the thing that took me almost 2 years to prove. He didn't reach out to me because he'd decided we needed space. He reached out because she told him to. She wrote the message. He just pressed send. And I knew that, eventually, because she'd been texting me from his phone for over 6 months. She just didn't know I'd figured it out. And she definitely didn't know I'd saved every single one. Let me take you back, because you can't understand what happened without understanding what I was protecting, what I thought I had. My dad's name is Gerald. Everyone calls him Gerry. He's the kind of man who keeps receipts in a rubber band in his wallet and knows the name of every cashier at his regular grocery store. He coached my Little League team even though I was terrible at softball. He drove 4 hours each way every single weekend for 6 months when I had my appendix out at 22 and wasn't handling the recovery well. Not because I asked him to, because that was just who Gerry was. We had a language, my dad and I. It wasn't words, mostly. It was him leaving the porch light on when I came home late, me always answering when he called, even if I was in the middle of something. Him texting me photos of sunsets from his back deck with no caption. Just the photo. Like, here, look, I thought of you. That was our whole relationship, in a lot of ways. Small, consistent acts of, I'm still here. I still see you. My mother's name is Diane. My parents divorced when I was 11. And I want to be careful here, because this isn't a story about a villain who was always a villain. Diane wasn't a monster when I was little. She was complicated. She worked a lot. She had her own wounds, her own history, things that made warmth difficult for her. She and I were never close the way Gerry and I were close, but that wasn't entirely her fault. We were just different frequencies. We never quite tuned in. When I was growing up, I thought Gerry got the short end of the divorce. He stayed in the family home. He paid the child support. He did the school pickups on his weeks, the doctor's appointments, the teacher conferences. Diane remarried quickly, within 2 years, to a man named Clifford, who had money and a house in a nicer neighborhood. And I went back and forth between them, the way kids do, carrying different versions of myself from house to house. I chose my dad. Not officially, custody was shared, but in every way that mattered. He was my safe landing. Now here's what you need to know about Gerry and Diane's post-divorce dynamic. They were civil. That was the word everyone used. Civil. They could be in the same room at graduations and family events. They texted about me, logistics, updates. They were not friends, but they were not enemies either. Or at least, that's what I believed for the first 28 years of my life. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that after Clifford died 3 years ago, that dynamic shifted. Quietly, the way ice shifts before it cracks. Diane, suddenly alone for the first time in decades, started reaching out to Gerry more. Under the guise of, we should stay in contact for Reyna's sake, for the grandkids I didn't have yet, for family. Gerry is a good man, a trusting man. He heard the word family and he opened the door. He should have checked who was on the other side first. The sacrifice inventory. I need to tell you what I gave up to stay close to my dad. Not because I want sympathy, I made those choices, I'd make them again, but because the weight of what was later used against me lives in these details. When I was 24, I had a job offer in Seattle. Real money. A role at a tech firm that would have launched my career in a completely different direction. I turned it down. Gerry had just been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, nothing immediately dangerous, but he was alone, he was managing badly, he was eating cereal for dinner 3 nights a week, and forgetting to check his blood sugar. I stayed. I moved into an apartment 12 minutes from his house. I was there on Sundays. I was there when he had his first scare, blood pressure spike, ambulance at 2 a.m., and I held his hand in the ER while the nurse explained what would happen next. I don't say this to be a martyr. I say this because, 2 years later, my mother would tell my father that I stayed in town not to support him, but because I was financially dependent, that I was too scared to launch my own life, that my presence wasn't love, it was need. She planted that seed so carefully, so patiently, the way you'd tend something you wanted to grow in the dark. Here's what else happened during those years. Gerry's health stabilized. He started walking every morning. We walked together, half the time, just around his neighborhood, him in his New Balance shoes, and me in whatever I'd grabbed off the floor. Those walks were where we talked, really talked, about his childhood, about his regrets with Diane, about what he wished he'd done differently when I was small. He told me once, and this is the part I've replayed so many times since, he said, "Reyna, you're the best decision I ever made. Everything else I'm not so sure about. But you I'm sure about." I'm telling you that because I want you to understand the height of what was about to be dismantled. This wasn't a strained relationship where estrangement was waiting to happen. This was solid ground. Ground I'd helped build, ground I'd watered, ground I had every reason to believe would hold. Until the texts started changing. The first signal. It started small, the way these things always do. About 18 months before that text in the kitchen, my dad's messages started feeling off. Not wrong, exactly, just slightly to the right of what I'd expect, like someone was writing with his words, but a different hand. He'd never been a big texter. His messages were usually short, functional. "Dinner Sunday? Saw that movie you mentioned. Pretty good. Call me when you get a chance." That kind of thing. Warm, but minimal. That was Gerry's register. So when I started getting messages that were longer, more probing, questions about my finances, my job stability, my plans for the next few years, questions framed in this specific way, not curious, exactly, but evaluating, I noticed. And I filed it, and I didn't know what to do with it yet. One message in particular. This was around 14 months before the kitchen moment. He, or whoever was writing as him, asked me if I was still leaning on Dad for support or if I'd figured out how to stand on my own. Those were the exact words. I remember because they landed wrong. They landed like something said to wound and dressed up as concern. because my dad knew I wasn't leaning on him financially. I'd paid back the money I'd borrowed, all of it, down to the last installment, with a card and a bottle of whiskey he liked. We'd had that conversation. He knew. So who was asking? I called him that night, just to hear his voice, just to reality check my own instincts. He answered on the second ring, sounded like himself, easy, unhurried. I said, "Hey, your last text was a little weird." He said, "What text?" Long pause. Then, "Oh, your mom was visiting earlier. She might have grabbed my phone to show me something on the screen. I was making dinner." He laughed it off. I laughed with him. I hung up and sat with the ceiling for a while. My mother had been at his house. My mother had used his phone, and she had texted me, from his number, a question designed to make him doubt me. I'm not even kidding when I tell you, that was the moment. That was the moment I should have understood what I was dealing with. But I talked myself out of it. I told myself I was being paranoid, oversensitive, that my mother wasn't strategic enough for something like this. That was my first mistake, underestimating her. The architecture of control. Here's what I've come to understand about Diane with the benefit of hindsight and roughly 400 screenshots. She is not cruel in the way people imagine cruel. She doesn't rage. She doesn't make scenes. She doesn't fight dirty in the way that leaves marks everyone can see. Her particular talent, and I have to call it that because it's operated at a genuinely high level, is the long, careful reshape. The slow redirect, the patient, surgical adjustment of someone's perception of reality until they're standing exactly where she wants them, and they believe they walked there themselves. After Clifford died, she was alone for the first time since she was 34. She was 61. Her children, I have a half-sister from Clifford's first marriage, Becca, who barely speaks to anyone, were scattered. Her social world had been Clifford's social world, and his friends grieved him and moved on. She was left in a house that was too big, with a grief she didn't have the vocabulary for, and the very particular desperation of a woman who has always defined herself through her proximity to someone powerful. And Gerry was there. Gerry, good, steady, reliably kind Gerry, answered her calls. Came over once to help with a leaking pipe because she didn't know who else to call. Had dinner with her twice, just out of habit and decency, because he is the kind of man who doesn't know how to say no to someone who looks lonely. I don't think she planned what came next. Not initially. I think it evolved. She started going over more, bringing food. She's a good cook, always has been, and Gerry's eating habits were a running joke in our family. She started being present in his daily life in a way that was easy to frame as old friends, exes who'd arrived at a functional peace, and slowly, incrementally, she started talking to him about me. Not dramatically. Not Reyna is a terrible daughter. That would have been too obvious, and Diane is never obvious. It was softer than that, more surgical. It was, I worry about Reyna sometimes. I think she relies on you too much. I think she's stunted herself by staying so close to home. It was, have you noticed she never talks about her future? I wonder if she's afraid of something. It was, I love her, I do, but I think you enabling her might be the thing holding her back. The kind of things that sound like concern, the kind of things that make a good father turn them over in his mind at 3 a.m. The kind of things that, over 6 months of consistent, calm, private repetition, rearrange what someone believes to be true. She was building a case. And she was building it in a room I wasn't allowed into. The first real crack. The first time I felt the crack beneath my feet was Thanksgiving, the year before the text. Gerry had always done Thanksgiving at his house. It was our tradition, just us, sometimes with my dad's brother Marcus and his family, sometimes with neighbors, always loud and relaxed and ending with bad television. I'd been helping cook since I was old enough to hold a peeler. That year, he called me a week before and told me Diane would be joining us. I'll be honest, my first reaction was no, a full-body, instinctive no. But I swallowed it. I was 28. I wasn't going to be the daughter who made her father's life harder because she couldn't be adult enough to share a table with her mother. I said, "Okay, Dad, that's fine." It wasn't fine. Not because Diane did anything overtly wrong. She was pleasant. She complimented the house. She helped clear plates. She and Gerry had easy, familiar conversation in the kitchen while I sat at the table and felt the slow, strange vertigo of watching my space become someone else's. But it was one moment, specifically. One moment that I replayed so many times afterward. My dad was looking for the spare key to the storage shed, something Marcus needed, and he asked if I knew where it was. Because I'd know. I always knew. We had a shorthand about his house that was built from years of showing up, of paying attention, of being the person who remembered where things were. I told him, "It's in the junk drawer, behind the takeout menus, inside that little ceramic dish Marcus made in 8th grade. He found it exactly where I said. He held it up, laughed, said of course, and then Diane from across the kitchen smiled in this particular way I'd seen before. Small, knowing, and she said, quietly, not unkindly, "She's got quite a grip on this house." That was all. That was the whole comment. And Marcus laughed, and my dad moved on, and nobody else in the room probably even heard it. But I heard it, and I watched my father's face for just a second, half a second, register something. Not agreement, just a small, almost invisible flicker of consideration. She'd planted something. Right there. Right in front of me. And there wasn't a single thing I could say without looking exactly like what she was suggesting I was. I drove home that night with the heat on high because I couldn't get warm, and I thought, something is changing. I don't know what it is yet, but something is changing. January, 4 months after Thanksgiving. The texts picked up in frequency. Now here's what I want you to understand about the timeline. Because the timeline matters, I've reconstructed it carefully. In January, Gerry had a small medical procedure. Routine, a biopsy on a mole that turned out to be nothing, but it spooked him. He was home for a few days, not driving. Diane started coming over more regularly. She framed it as helping out. She cooked. She organized. She was present in a way that, from the outside, looked like generosity. I came over too. Of course I came over. But here's the thing she understood, and I didn't. Not yet. When you're the person who's always there, your presence stops being remarkable. It becomes background, expected. And the new presence, the one that's choosing to show up, choosing to sacrifice their time, that one registers as a gift. She was performing care in a way designed to make mine look like obligation. During those 2 weeks, I got 7 texts from my dad's number that, in retrospect, were almost certainly written by her. I know this now because of specific word choices, phrases my dad never used, structures too long for his thumb typing style, but at the time, I just thought he was being unusually communicative. Maybe the scare had softened something. Maybe he was in a reflective mood. One of those texts said, "I've been thinking about whether I've been too available to you, whether that's good for either of us." Look, I sat with that for 3 days. 3 days of spiraling, of wondering if maybe they were right, if maybe I had made myself too central, too present, too woven into a life that wasn't mine. That's the insidious genius of what she was doing, She was using my relationship with my father to make me question that relationship, making me wonder if my closeness was a pathology. I'm embarrassed to say this now, I even considered pulling back, giving him space, visiting less, calling less, which of course was exactly what she wanted. But I didn't. And here's why. Because the next Sunday I came for our usual walk, and Gerry was the same as he'd always been. Warm, present, happy to see me. He didn't mention needing space. He didn't seem to have any idea what he'd said. So I made a decision. A small, quiet decision that would, many months later, change everything. I started saving the texts. Not because I had a plan, not because I was already building a case. I saved them the way you save a receipt for something you're not sure about, instinctively, protectively, not knowing yet whether you'll need it. I saved them because something in me knew, even before the rest of me was ready to admit it, that I was going to need proof of something. I just didn't know proof of what. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being gaslit by someone who loves you, or someone who used to. Because it's not the loud, explosive kind of pain, the kind that announces itself. It's quieter than that. It's the loneliness of sitting across from someone at dinner and feeling like you're speaking a language they've been slowly, quietly unlearning. And you don't know when they stopped. You just know that something doesn't translate anymore. That's where I spent about 8 months of my life, between January and September of that year, in that gap between knowing something was wrong and being able to prove it. Let me walk you through what that looked like. Day to day, because I think people imagine gaslighting as this cinematic thing, accusations, confrontations, someone screaming you're crazy across a kitchen. It's not. It's so much smaller than that. It's so much more boring. That's what makes it work. February. My dad started canceling on Sundays. Not every Sunday, that would have been obvious. 1 in 3, roughly. Always with a reason that made sense on its own. He wasn't feeling well, he had something to do, he was tired. Each reason, individually, completely plausible. Gerry was 64, he had health stuff, he was entitled to a quiet Sunday, but I'd been showing up at that house every Sunday for 6 years. And I knew his patterns. I knew when he was genuinely tired and when something else was going on, and this felt like something else. When I asked him directly, once, carefully, he said, "I just think it's good for both of us to have more independent lives. You shouldn't feel like you have to check on me every week." Those weren't Gerry's words. Gerry had never once used the phrase independent lives in any conversation we'd had. I know this because I know how he talks. He says, "Do your own thing." He says, "Don't worry about me." He does not construct sentences with sociological precision. Diane had coached him, or written it. I still don't know which, fully, maybe both, at different times. I didn't say any of that. I said, "Okay, Dad, of course." And I went home and I sat in my car in my own parking lot for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. The smell of the car. That's what I remember. The synthetic warmth of the seat heaters and the faint pine of an air freshener I'd had so long it didn't smell like pine anymore. Just like car. I sat in that smell and I tried to figure out how to hold something that kept shifting. I should have been angrier. I know that now. But when it's your parent, when you've built your sense of safety around someone, you don't go to anger first. You go to, "Am I wrong?" You go to, "Is he right?" You go to, "Maybe I have been too much. Maybe I need to examine this." That's the thing about Diane's strategy. It didn't just attack my relationship with my dad. It attacked my relationship with my own perception. And that's a much harder thing to fight. The microaggressions. March. I started keeping a log, not of the texts, I was already doing that, but of specific moments. Things said in my presence. Observations made. The texture of the shift. I'm going to read you some of these directly because I think the specificity matters. These are from my notes app, exactly as I typed them. March 4th. Dad's house for his birthday dinner. Diane there. She asked about my job in front of everyone at the table, phrased it as curiosity, but lingered on, and that's enough to support yourself on? When I mentioned my salary. Dad looked uncomfortable, but didn't say anything. She moved on before I could respond properly. March 17th. Dad texted to say he was thinking about updating his will, said he wanted to be fair to everyone. When I asked what that meant, he went quiet, said he'd talk to me later, has not talked to me later. March 28th. Got a text from Dad's phone at 11 p.m. asking whether I had a 5-year plan. This is not something Gerry has ever cared about. He once told me he doesn't believe in 5-year plans because life doesn't move in straight lines. I know who wrote this. Here's what Diane understood that I didn't, not yet, about the anatomy of what she was doing. She wasn't trying to make my father hate me. That would be too visible, too fragile, too easily reversed by a single good Sunday between us. She was doing something more durable. She was constructing a story about me. A specific, coherent, internally consistent story. The story of a daughter who, out of fear and arrested development, had attached herself too completely to her aging father, who was a burden disguised as a gift, who needed to be, carefully and lovingly, detached for his sake and hers. It's actually almost brilliant, because every element of it was deniable. Every single piece could be explained as genuine concern, and because it was delivered slowly, over months, it didn't register as an attack. It registered as an accumulation. A weight of small truths that, stacked together, started to feel like a verdict. She was narrating me out of my father's life, and she was doing it in his voice. The thing with the money. April. This is where it got concrete. My father had money. Not vast wealth. He wasn't a rich man, but he'd been careful his whole life. He'd paid off the house. He had a pension from 30 years at the same company, a company that no longer exists, but that honored its obligations. He had savings. He was, by any reasonable measure, financially comfortable for the rest of his life. I'd never thought much about it. It wasn't my money. I hadn't factored it into any plan. I had my own apartment, my own income, my own IRA that I contributed to every month like a good little responsible adult. My dad's finances were his business. But in April, something shifted in that department too. He called me, an actual call, not a text, which was notable, and told me he was thinking about lending Diane some money. Not a small amount. A significant amount to help her cover some expenses related to Clifford's estate that hadn't fully settled. He presented it casually, like he was mentioning a grocery run. I asked how much. He told me. I was quiet for a second longer than I should have been. Look, it wasn't my place to tell him what to do with his money. I knew that. But something in me went cold. Because here is a woman who has spent 6 months quietly rearranging my father's perception of his own daughter, and now she's in his finances. Now she's in the part of his life that is the most concrete, the most permanent, the hardest to undo. I said carefully, "Dad, have you talked to anyone else about this, a financial advisor?" He said Diane had looked into it and it was straightforward. I said, "I'd just feel better if you had an independent set of eyes on it." He said, and I felt this one, "Reyna, I know you're worried, but this isn't really your concern." Not your concern. 6 years of Sunday walks, 6 years of emergency calls and grocery runs and knowing where the spare key lives and sitting in the ER at 2 a.m., and suddenly his finances weren't my concern. I didn't say anything else. I said okay. I said I loved him. I hung up and I opened my notes app and I typed for 45 minutes without stopping. That was the night I stopped wondering if I was paranoid. May, 3 months before the kitchen text. I need to tell you how I confirmed what I already suspected, because this is the part that went from instinct to evidence, and the confirmation came from the most mundane, accidental source imaginable. My dad has a tablet, an old iPad he uses to video call me sometimes, and mostly to watch baseball highlights. He'd left it at my apartment after a visit, which happened occasionally, and I was going to drop it back to him the next day. I set it on my coffee table and went to bed. In the morning, I picked it up to put it in my bag, and the screen lit up from the motion. There was a notification on the screen, a message preview, just the first line, visible without unlocking. It was from Diane. And the first line read, "Did you send her the text I wrote? I think we need to." I stood in my kitchen. The coffee machine was running. There was a pigeon on my windowsill doing that thing pigeons do, that relentless, mechanical cooing. I stood there and I read those 14 words 7 times. Did you send her the text I wrote? I'm not even kidding. My first emotion wasn't rage. It was something closer to relief, the specific, almost physical relief of having the floor come back under your feet after months of not being sure it was there. I wasn't paranoid, I wasn't oversensitive, I wasn't too attached or too fearful or too anything. There was a campaign, there were drafted texts, there was a woman who had been writing in my father's voice and sending them to his daughter and calling it concern. I put the tablet down. I made my coffee, I sat with it, and then I thought, okay, now what? Here's the thing about going from victim to strategist. People imagine it as this cinematic transformation. You see the truth, you get angry, you make a plan, you execute. But it's not like that. It's slower, it's messier. It involves a lot of staring at the ceiling and second-guessing yourself, and asking whether you're about to blow up the last intact relationship in your immediate family over something you might be misreading. I didn't unlock the tablet. I want to be clear about that. I didn't go looking through his messages. I had one preview, 14 words, and that was enough. What I did was, I went back through everything I'd already saved. Every text from my dad's number that had felt wrong, every odd phrasing, every uncharacteristic question, every sentence that was too long or too structured or too careful for how Gerry actually communicates. I started sorting them. I made a document. I color-coded it, which I realize sounds deeply unhinged, but when you're trying to organize 2 years of ambient wrongness into something legible, you color code. Green, texts that sounded like my dad, his cadence, his vocabulary, his emotional register. Yellow, texts that felt slightly off, possible Diane involvement but not conclusive. Red, texts that were almost certainly not written by my father at all. By the end of that first sorting session, I had 23 red texts, 23 messages over 14 months that I could now see, could really see, without the fog of wanting to believe, were drafted by Diane and sent from his phone, each one designed to erode something. My confidence, his trust, the specific language of closeness we'd built. But here's what I didn't have yet. I didn't have her drafts. I didn't have her voice in it. I had her output, but not her process. And if I was going to do this properly, if I was going to bring this to my father in a way he could actually receive, I needed the thing he couldn't deny. Not my interpretation. Her words. Her actual words, in her voice, showing the intent. So I waited. I kept saving, and I started paying closer attention to the moments when she had access to his phone. June and July were the hardest months, because I was doing two things simultaneously that pulled in opposite directions. I was building a case, quietly, methodically, with the kind of deliberate patience I did not know I possessed. Every text screenshot, every note, cross-referencing dates with the occasions I knew Diane had been at my dad's house, times he'd mentioned her visits, casually, the way you mention weather. I built a timeline. I built a pattern, and at the same time, I was watching my relationship with my father deteriorate in real time, and I couldn't say a word about why. I had to show up at his house and be normal. I had to take the Sunday cancellations without pressing. I had to receive the increasingly strange text messages asking about my finances, my plans, my independence, my reliance on the family unit, an actual phrase that appeared in one message in July, and respond with patience I didn't feel. The cognitive load of that is something I underestimated. Knowing something and not being able to use it yet. Carrying evidence in your pocket while the person you're protecting it to prove a point to sits across from you and asks if you want more coffee. There were nights I almost said something. One Sunday in June, we were on our walk. It was a good one, easy and warm, and for a stretch of about 15 minutes, it felt like before. Like nothing had changed. And I thought, just tell him. Just say it. Show him the screenshot from the tablet. Watch his face. Get it over with. But I didn't. Because I'd thought it through, and I knew what would happen if I went to him too early. He would be caught between us. He would feel accused. He would call Diane, who would have an explanation. She always has an explanation. And whatever small seed of doubt I'd planted would be swallowed by her narrative. She'd been working on him for over a year. I'd had 2 months of evidence and a 14-word preview. That wasn't enough. I needed more. I needed the thing that would make him see it without being able to rationalize it away. And in August, she gave it to me. The text that changed everything. August 14th. I remember the date because it was the day after my birthday. My dad had taken me to dinner the night before, just us, which had become rare enough that I'd marked it carefully, and it had been good. We laughed. We talked about nothing important. He paid, which he always insists on, and hugged me for a beat longer than usual in the parking lot. The next morning, I got a text from his number at 9:17 a.m. I'm going to read it to you. Word for word. Because this is the text that broke the whole thing open. Reyna, I've been doing a lot of thinking. I've spoken to your mother, and we've both agreed that the dynamic between us has become unhealthy. I think you've been using our closeness as a substitute for building your own life, and I've been enabling that without realizing it. I love you, but I think some real distance, not just space, but distance, would be good for both of us. I'd like you to stop coming by on Sundays for now. I'll be in touch when I'm ready. I read it 4 times. And then I called him, immediately. He picked up on the 3rd ring, sounded normal. I said, Dad, I just got your text. Silence. Then, what text? Longer silence. Then, oh Reyna, I'm sorry, your mother was here this morning. I didn't mean for that to go like that. I said, Dad, did you write that? He didn't answer. I said, Dad, I need you to tell me if you wrote that. He said, very quietly, she had some points that I think are worth considering. I've been thinking about it too. I said, but you didn't write it. He said, Reyna, I have to go. He hung up. I sat on the floor of my hallway. I don't know why the hallway. I just didn't make it to the couch. The carpet was thin and slightly scratchy under my palms, and there was a water stain on the ceiling I'd been meaning to report to my landlord for 3 months, and I sat there and I looked at it and I thought, okay, this is what it is now. Not grief. Not yet. Something more operational than grief. The way your brain goes very quiet and very clear right after something breaks, before the full weight of it arrives. She'd written a speech for my father to deliver to his daughter, a speech about why he was stepping back, and he'd let her send it. Which meant whatever she'd been building in him, whatever alternate version of me she'd constructed, was now real enough that he'd handed her the wheel. I went to my laptop. I opened the document, and I started building. I want to describe what the next 6 weeks look like, because I think it's important. I think people need to understand that revenge, if you want to call it that, though I'd call it something more like correction, is not dramatic. It's not cinematic. It is deeply, profoundly boring. It is the work of someone who has decided that being right matters more than being comfortable. I built a master document, organized chronologically. Every text I'd screenshotted, and there were now 61 of them, with a notation next to each one, date, what was happening in the family timeline that week, whose handwriting I believed it was, and the specific element of the narrative it was designed to serve. Because that's what I'd come to understand. This wasn't random. Each message had a purpose and a larger architecture. There were messages designed to make me seem financially dependent, messages designed to make me seem emotionally stunted, messages designed to position my presence in his life as a burden rather than a choice, and messages, the ones that came in waves, designed to reframe his natural affection for me as weakness, as enabling, as something to be corrected rather than celebrated. She'd written a character, a specific, coherent, internally consistent character called Reyna, and she'd fed that character to my father, one text at a time, until the real Reyna, the one who drove him to chemo appointments and knew where the spare key was and made him laugh, had been quietly replaced by the fictional one. Somewhere in week 3 of the audit, I found the thread that mattered most. I'd been so focused on the texts sent to me that I'd almost missed the meta level. I had some of her outgoing messages too. Because of 2 instances, the tablet notification and one time earlier in the year when she'd accidentally responded to one of my texts as herself before deleting and resending from his number, I had her actual voice, her actual phrasing, Diane's register, not Gerry's. And when I laid those 2 messages next to the red flag texts, the linguistic fingerprint was undeniable. The same sentence structure, the same rhythm of subordinate clauses, the same particular use of the word dynamic, which Diane uses constantly and my father has never used once in 64 years of living. I had her. I knew I had her. The question now wasn't whether I had enough. The question was, how do you show a man that the person he's been trusting has been writing fiction in his name without making him feel like a fool for believing it? September. The text in the kitchen. I'd gone to his house, not for our regular Sunday, which she'd already eliminated, but because he'd called. Actually called. His voice on the phone sounding a little like himself again, uncertain, a little raw. He said, "Can you come over? I want to talk." I came over. The kitchen smelled like burnt toast because he'd forgotten the toaster setting again, same as he always did. The yellow tile around the sink, the wobbling chair, all of it exactly as it had always been, and all of it suddenly fragile in a way it hadn't been before. He sat across from me and he said he was sorry about how things had gone, that he cared about me, that he didn't want to hurt me. And then he said, carefully, like he'd rehearsed it, I think your mother has raised some things that are worth taking seriously. I think maybe some time apart would. I said, Dad, stop. He looked at me, just looked. I said, before you finish that sentence, I need you to look at something. I put my phone on the table. I'd prepared a folder, a specific curated selection, not everything. The right things, in the right order, starting with the August 14th text and working backward to the January texts and ending with the 2 messages where her voice slipped through. 22 screenshots. Organized. Labeled. I said, I'm going to sit here while you read these. Take as long as you need. And I watched my father's face. I don't have a dramatic description for what happened next. There was no shouting. There was no table flipping. There was just a very quiet man going very still, reading the record of something he'd participated in without fully understanding he was participating. He read all 22 screenshots. It took 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the microwave. When he put the phone down, he didn't look at me right away. He looked at the table. At the yellow tile around the sink, at the window where the porch light switch was, the one he'd always left on for me. Then he looked at me and he said, How long have you known? I said, Long enough. He put his head in his hands. Not dramatically, just the gesture of a man processing something that doesn't have a clean emotional category. Something between shame and grief and the particular disorientation of realizing the floor has been built on different materials than you thought. I didn't touch him. I didn't comfort him. I waited, because I'd been waiting for months, and I could wait 11 more minutes. Finally, he said, I'm so sorry, Reyna. And then he said something else, something I wasn't expecting. He said, There's more you don't know yet. There's more you don't know yet. 6 words. 6 words that rearranged the entire shape of what I thought I was dealing with. I'd come into that kitchen thinking I had the whole picture. Thinking the story was, my mother had been impersonating my father over text for over a year, slowly poisoning his perception of me, trying to replace me in his life with herself. That was the story. That was what I'd built the case around. That was what I'd been waiting to prove. But Gerry's face, when he said those 6 words, had something in it I hadn't prepared for. It wasn't shame. It wasn't just the disorientation of a man realizing he'd been manipulated. It was something older than that. Heavier. The look of someone who's been keeping a room locked for a long time and has finally been handed reason to open the door. I said, What do you mean? He said, The money. And then he told me something that explained everything and made it so much worse. What Gerry knew, the loan, the one from April, the significant amount of money he'd mentioned casually, the one I'd tried to raise a flag about and been told wasn't my concern. It wasn't a loan, or rather, it started as a loan. That's how Diane had framed it. Clifford's estate, some outstanding expenses, just needs a bridge. She'd pay it back within 6 months. Gerry had given her the money. He'd done it quietly, without telling me because she'd asked him not to. She'd said it would embarrass her if I knew she was struggling. He'd respected that. 6 months had passed. She hadn't paid any of it back. When he'd raised it gently, she'd told him she needed more time. She'd also, in the same conversation, made a suggestion. She'd said that if he was thinking about his estate planning, which they'd apparently discussed, because she'd been nudging him in that direction for months, she'd be happy to help him think through it. She knew a financial advisor. She'd make some calls. The financial advisor she'd recommended was a man named Terrence, who turned out, when I looked him up 3 days later, to share a last name with Diane's late husband. Not the same last name as Clifford, a different one. the last name of Clifford's business partner, a man who'd had a long and murky professional relationship with Clifford's estate. I'm not a lawyer. I can't tell you with certainty what the legal framework of all that was, but I can tell you what it looked like from the outside. It looked like a woman who'd spent a year removing the only person who might ask uncomfortable questions from her target's immediate circle, and was now moving into position. She hadn't done all of this because she wanted my father. She'd done it because she wanted access to what my father had, and I, steady, nearby, paying attention Reyna, was the obstacle, the one variable she couldn't control from the outside. So she'd spent 14 months making sure he'd do the removing himself. I sat at that kitchen table and I felt the full shape of it settle. The real shape. Not just manipulation. Architecture. She'd built something. Something patient and intricate and genuinely clever. And she'd almost gotten away with it. Almost. We sat in that kitchen for 3 hours. Gerry talked. I listened. He told me things he'd never told me, about how the year had felt from his side, how Diane had framed her concern for me as something born from guilt, her own guilt, about how the divorce had affected our relationship, how she'd said she just wanted to help him see me clearly without the rose-colored glasses of a doting father, how she'd made him feel, gently and persistently, that loving me the way he'd always loved me was actually a failure of parenting. She'd used his love for me to weaponize his love for me. I want you to sit with that for a second. She'd found the thing he was most proud of, being a good father, and convinced him that the very qualities that made him one were the qualities holding me back. It's almost elegant, in the most devastating way. He cried, not dramatically, just eyes that went wet and stayed that way. He kept saying, I should have called you. I should have just called you and asked. And I kept not saying what I wanted to say, which was, yes. You should have. I was right here. Because here's the thing I've had to make my peace with, and it took a long time. My father is not a villain in this story. He's not even a fool. He's a good man who was lonely in ways he didn't fully acknowledge, who was approached by someone who spoke the language of family and concern and history, and who trusted her more than he should have because she was my mother and he still, somewhere in himself, believed that she must love me too. He was wrong about that. But it's not a stupid thing to have believed. By the time we'd gotten through all of it, the money, the timeline, the texts, what he told her and what she told him, and how the whole mechanism had worked, it was past midnight. The kitchen felt different than it had at the start of the evening. Not fixed, not safe yet, but honest. Which was something it hadn't been for a long time. He asked me what I wanted to do. I said, I want to make sure she can't do this to you. Or to me. Or to anyone else. He said, okay, tell me what you need. And I'd been waiting for those words for 8 months. Let me be precise about what the next 2 weeks looked like. Because this is the part people always want to skip to. The execution, the confrontation, the moment of reckoning, without understanding that the reckoning is only satisfying if the preparation is airtight. The whole architecture of what Diane had built was deniability. My only counter to deniability was documentation so thorough that there was nothing left to deny. Gerry gave me access to his phone. Not forensically, we weren't mounting a legal case, though we discussed whether we should, but completely. He handed me his phone and said, do what you need to do. I went through 14 months of his message thread with Diane. What I found there was its own education. The messages she'd sent him, her real messages, her actual voice, not the ones she'd written for him to forward to me, were a masterclass in the architecture of soft manipulation. Nothing threatening, nothing explicit. Every message framed as love, concern, history, shared investment in Reyna's well-being. But beneath the framing, if you read carefully, if you laid them out in sequence the way I did, a clear, deliberate, patient dismantling of a relationship. There was one message from March, 6 months before the kitchen, that I still think about. She'd written, "I think Reyna has built her whole identity around being your good daughter, and I think she'd rather stay in that role than grow. I worry that as long as you let her, she will, and I don't think that's fair. To either of you. Look." That's well written. I'm not even going to pretend it isn't. It's calibrated to land perfectly on a man who loves his daughter and is afraid of having failed her. It uses my genuine qualities, my loyalty, my consistency, my rootedness, and reframes them as pathology. It's vicious in the most respectable clothes imaginable. I printed 87 pages, I bought a binder, I organized it with tabs, evidence of impersonation, evidence of financial overreach, evidence of deliberate narrative construction, dates, receipts, phone records Gerry pulled, the timeline of when Diane had been present at the house cross, referenced with when the anomalous texts appeared in my phone. It was, honestly, the most organized I've ever been in my life. Grief will do that sometimes. Grief with a purpose is very, very tidy. Here's something the revenge fantasy never accounts for. The part where you have to tell other people. Because this wasn't a private wound. Diane had an audience. She had people who believed her version of events, some of Clifford's old social circle, a few family members on her side, and critically, my dad's brother Marcus, who'd been fed a version of the story and had pulled back from me that summer without me quite understanding why. Marcus. I have to tell you about Marcus because his reaction was the one I was most afraid of and the one that ended up mattering most. Marcus is Gerry's younger brother. He's loud and opinionated and was always my favorite uncle growing up, the one who'd slipped me $20 at Christmas and told me not to tell my dad. He'd also been at Thanksgiving when Diane had made the comment about my grip on the house, and I'd watched him laugh without thinking about it. Gerry called Marcus first. I sat in the next room and listened to one side of it. It went quiet very quickly. The kind of quiet that means someone is reading something on their phone because the other person has just sent them a photograph. I heard Marcus say, at one point, "She sent that from your number?" And then a long silence, and then, "Gerry, I'm sorry, she told me I should have called Reyna directly." He called me himself 10 minutes later. He didn't open with an apology, he opened with, "I'm going to need you to walk me through this from the beginning," which is the Marcus version of an apology. We talked for 90 minutes. By the end of it, he'd said 3 things I didn't expect. That he'd always thought something was off about the timeline, that he'd noticed Diane was at Gerry's house more than seemed natural, and that he was sorry he'd let himself be comfortable with a story that made me the problem. That last one hit different than I thought it would. Then there was Diane's half-daughter, Becca, the one who barely speaks to anyone. I debated whether to contact her at all. But I did, eventually, because she deserved to know what had been done in the vicinity of her stepfather's estate. I sent her a version of the documentation. A shorter version. She responded in 4 words, "This tracks. Thank you." That was the entirety of Becca's contribution to this chapter of events. I respected it. The money, we saw a lawyer. Not to pursue anything criminal, the legal landscape around what Diane had done was, as the attorney explained, complicated. Impersonation in a family context via text message is a murky area. The financial piece was more concrete, but also more dependent on documentation we'd have to fight to get. What the lawyer did, very clearly, very usefully, was help Gerry understand what exposure he currently had and what steps he needed to take to close it. She helped him draft a letter to Terrence, the financial advisor Diane had recommended, formally severing any advisory relationship. She helped him restructure some accounts. She helped him document the loan formally with interest terms and send Diane a registered letter outlining the expectation of repayment. I was not in the room for most of this. These were Gerry's decisions to make. I was there as a witness, not an executor. I want to be clear about that distinction because it matters. This wasn't my revenge. It was my father reclaiming his own story. I just helped him see what the story actually was. The registered letter landed on a Tuesday. Diane called Gerry within 2 hours. He didn't answer. For the first time in 3 years, he looked at her name on his screen and he put the phone face down on the counter and he walked away. He told me about it that night. He said, "It rang 6 times. I stood there and I counted. 6 times. Then voicemail." Here's where her composure started to slip. And I want to be precise about this, because watching someone's careful architecture crumble in real time is instructive. Not satisfying exactly, or not only satisfying, but instructive. It tells you something about who they actually are underneath the construction. She texted Gerry 17 times that Tuesday. I know because he showed me. The texts began measured. "Gerald, I think there's been a misunderstanding, can we talk?" And within 4 hours had escalated to something much more revealing. Accusations that I had manipulated him, that I was unstable, that I'd fabricated the screenshots, that he was a vulnerable man being exploited by a daughter with financial motives. That last one. I want to sit there for a second. She accused me, the person who turned down a job in Seattle to stay near him during a health scare, who drove him to appointments, who sat in the ER at 2 a.m., who spent 6 months building a case not to take anything but to give him back the truth of having financial motives. It was the most clarifying thing she could have done, because it showed me, and more importantly showed Gerry, exactly what she'd been protecting all along. Not a relationship, not his well-being, her access, her position, the particular proximity she'd engineered. She called Marcus twice. He didn't answer either time, but he did send her a text, which he screenshot and sent to me, bless him, that said, "Done. I've seen the documentation. Please don't contact me about this." She tried one more move. She called me. This was 11 days after the registered letter. My phone lit up with her name, her actual name, from her actual number, not my dad's, and I stood in my kitchen and looked at it for 4 full rings. And then I answered. I'm not going to give you a dramatic scene. That's not what it was. She started with, "Reyna, I think you've made a serious mistake." Her voice was controlled. That particular brand of controlled that takes effort, the kind where you can hear the effort. I said, "Okay." She said she was concerned about my relationship with my father, that she'd only ever been trying to help, that what I'd done, going to him with accusations involving lawyers, upsetting his health, was exactly the kind of behavior she'd been trying to protect him from. She said, "This is why I was worried about you." I let her talk for 4 minutes without interrupting. I timed it. I sat on my kitchen floor, same spot as after the August text, same thin carpet, same water stain on the ceiling, and I let her build the structure of her argument without interruption. Because I'd learned something from her, actually. I'd learned that the most effective thing you can do when someone is constructing a fiction is let them finish it. Let them commit to it. Let it exist completely. Then I said, "Diane, I have 61 screenshots of texts sent from Dad's number. I have 2 messages where you responded as yourself before deleting and resending as him. I have a 14-word notification preview on his tablet. I have the full thread of your messages to him over 14 months, and I have a lawyer who has seen all of it." Real silence. not the pause of someone thinking, the silence of someone whose structure has just made contact with the floor. I said, I'm not going to tell you what to do, that's not my job, but I am going to tell you that Dad is protected now, financially and otherwise, and I am going to tell you that if anything happens, anything at all that seems designed to affect his life in a way that benefits you, I have everything I need to make a very complete and very detailed picture available to anyone who might want to see it. Another silence. Then she said, You've never understood what I was trying to do for you. And I said, I understand exactly what you were trying to do. That's the problem. She hung up. That was the last time we spoke. I'm going to be honest with you about the part after, the part that's less satisfying to tell. Gerry and I repaired our relationship. We did. It took months, and it wasn't linear, and there were conversations that were harder than the kitchen table night because they required us to sit with his role in it, his willingness to let himself be convinced without me swallowing that part to protect him. I didn't protect him from it. We went through it together. It was uncomfortable and necessary, and it is, genuinely, the most honest our relationship has ever been. The Sunday walks came back. Not immediately. 3 months after the kitchen, he texted me, from his own phone in his own words, short and plain and perfectly Gerry, Sunday? I'll make breakfast. I said yes. I didn't say anything else. I just said yes. The money. He recovered most of it, eventually, not all. Diane repaid a portion after the registered letter and went quiet. The rest is a complicated story involving Clifford's estate and Terrence and some decisions Gerry made before I knew to warn him, and it's not fully resolved even now. He's okay. Financially, he's okay. But there's a number that represents what trust costs, and he knows it, and I think he'll know it for the rest of his life. Marcus is back in our orbit, loudly, somewhat aggressively, in the way that is Marcus's version of making amends. He showed up at Gerry's birthday dinner with a bottle of whiskey, sat next to me all night, and told me 3 times that I'd done the right thing. The 3rd time I told him once was enough. He laughed. Things are, between us, approximately what they were. Diane. Here's the part I don't have a clean resolution for. She's still out there. She's still, as far as I can tell, who she is. She hasn't been charged with anything. She hasn't faced any formal consequence. What happened to her is, the thing she was building didn't get built. The access she was constructing got closed. The story she'd been writing got rewritten. Is that justice? I genuinely don't know. I've turned it over a lot. I think it's the closest to justice that was available. But it's not satisfying in the way I wanted it to be, back in the days when I was color-coding spreadsheets and imagining the moment of reckoning. The reckoning was quieter than I'd imagined. Most things are. I'm 31 now. 2 years out from the kitchen table. Here's what I know that I didn't know before. I know that the people who hurt us most are rarely the ones who announce it. They're the ones who use the language of love and family and concern to do it. They're the ones whose weapons are soft enough to be deniable. And the defense against that, the only real defense I found, is documentation and patience. Knowing what you know, trusting what you see. Not abandoning your own perception even when someone you love is presenting you with an alternate version of reality. I also know that I had flaws in this story. I need to say that clearly. I was too slow to trust my instincts in the early months. I underestimated Diane twice at critical junctures. I let my own need for everything to be fine with my father blind me to what was happening right in front of me. I chose comfort over clarity for longer than I should have. Those choices had costs. And I know, this is the one I sit with longest, that my father let himself be moved in a direction he should have questioned. He's not a villain. But he's not without responsibility either. He chose, at some level, to believe a story about me that didn't match 29 years of evidence. He chose to let someone else narrate his daughter to him rather than calling her directly. And whatever his reasons, loneliness, misplaced guilt, the particular vulnerability of aging without a partner, those choices had consequences for me that I am still, occasionally, finding in unexpected corners of my life. We don't talk about that part much. Me and Gerry, we've gotten good at the forward motion, the Sunday walks, the sunset photos with no caption. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's the most honest kind of repair, not excavating everything, but choosing, deliberately, to keep building. I don't know. I'm still figuring out where the line is between forgiveness and avoidance. I suspect it'll take a while. Here's the thing I keep coming back to. The thing that doesn't resolve. Diane is a woman who lost her husband, who found herself alone and afraid, and without the scaffolding of a life she'd built around someone else, who looked at the wreckage and tried to build new scaffolding from whatever materials were available, who chose, and yes, it was a choice, I want to be clear that it was a choice, to do that building in a way that required dismantling someone else's foundation. Does that context excuse what she did? No. Clearly, obviously no. Does it make it more comprehensible? Does it mean she's a real, broken, human person rather than a cartoon of selfishness? Yeah, I think it does. And I'm not sure what to do with that. I'm not sure you're supposed to do anything with it. Maybe. Maybe the most honest thing I can offer you is she was wrong and she was comprehensible, and those two things don't cancel each other out. They just both exist. Simultaneously. Without resolution. That's the part of the story no one tells you about. After the documentation, after the confrontation, after the registered letter and the lawyer, and the moment of reckoning in your father's kitchen, there's still this. There's still the fact of her. The fact of someone who did real damage and who is also inescapably a person. I don't forgive her. I want to be clear. I don't. Maybe someday. I'm not there yet, and I'm not going to perform being there to give this a tidier ending. What I have instead is, I know what happened. Completely, documentable, thoroughly, I have the record. And she knows I have it. And Gerry knows what he chose, and what it cost to fix it. And on Sunday mornings, I walk around a neighborhood I've walked around for 6 years, next to a man in New Balance shoes who leaves the porch light on, and we don't talk about any of it. We just walk. And for right now, that's enough.